Roger Williams University is hosting a crisis management seminar on May 3rd at their Providence campus. Crises, whether a natural disaster, cyber attack, or financial instability, can have severe repercussions if not handled properly. This is where crisis management plays a pivotal role. Join Roger Williams MBA students and expert speakers to learn how to prepare for the unexpected. The program is totally free and open to the public. You can register online at rwu.edu/events/crisis-management-symposium.
This is the Bartholomew Town Podcast.
All right, good morning, everybody. On the day after Rhode Island's primary elections, Bill Bartholomew here with you in what was, at one point, a very, very close race inside the Democratic primary for governor. At one point around 8:30, Helena Bonanno Folks and Governor McKee were separated by 31 votes in terms of tabulation. And as this was taking place, and I was on the radio moderating the panel on WPRO throughout the course of the night, along with Dan McGowan of the Boston Globe and Jim Hummel, what we were looking at, something that caught my attention right away, was that Cumberland precincts were only reporting at about 50%. And of course, Dan McKee from Cumberland, the 12-year mayor in Cumberland, has a huge base of support in northern Rhode Island. He's part of that. In fact, he's probably in many ways the leader of that Blackstone River Valley, northern Rhode Island mayoral peer group. So you got the sense that whatever returns were yet to come from Cumberland and throughout northern Rhode Island were probably going to skew heavily towards Dan McKee, as well as mail ballots. With the early voting and mail ballots, with the get out the vote effort of the unions, which were backing, by and large, Governor McKee, you got the sense that he had a pathway to pull away. But nonetheless, a very, very close race. And it goes to show you that in a five-way primary, when you don't have ranked choice voting, it can become a scenario where just a few thousand votes, especially when you have turnout that doesn't, even come close to the vast majority of, registered voters in the state participating in the primary. Hardly a mandate for Governor McKee. Nonetheless, he did prevail. Governor McKee advances to the general election where he will match up against Ashley Kalis in November. And look, Kalis has a shot. There's no, major infrastructure. She's not getting a lot of donations. But as Dan McGowan pointed out last night, and even on our podcast that we did together on Monday, the Kalis campaign, they're going to try to run back the folks' messaging, education, the outsider voice, being a woman in politics. They're going to try to throw the barbs at Governor McKee with respect to the ILO deal and maybe even Tony Silva and the wetlands controversy. It's in many ways going to be a regurgitation of what we saw in the final days and weeks of the Helena Folks, Dan McKee matchup inside that Democratic primary. And there's much being made this morning about this scenario where Governor McKee, when he was on the podium, giving his victory speech, and someone from the Folks campaign called Eva Mancuso, who works in the McKee campaign, trying to get folks on the line, or maybe she was even herself on the line, to talk to Governor McKee, presumably to concede. And McKee, while on the podium in the midst of his victory speech, said, that's not going to happen. Hang up on them. So that's a crude, an unfortunate scenario. Should the governor have been even interrupted with the possibility of taking that phone call? Definitely not. But I don't think that the way he handled that is going to resonate very well with a lot of people. And even if it doesn't hurt him in a political sense, I think a lot of people are going to say, man, that's just something that you don't want to see. It's just a level of behavior that I get the adrenaline's pumping, and and a win is a win, and sometimes it's good to spike the football when you've been in a hard-fought battle. But I wonder how that's going to impact some people's just sort of motivation when it comes to Dan McKee. I mean, again, he should not have been interrupted in any way, shape, or form when he was up there giving the speech. Now, the Folks people said that they didn't realize he was giving a speech. He was scheduled to deliver his remarks at 10:50, so she called around, 10:40, probably hoping to get him on the phone before he took to the podium. It's just an unfortunate scenario. it may go away, right? It's not something that I'm personally going to harp on, but I think it's something that some people will remember in a negative context. And so the way that this whole thing kind of closed out last night wasn't that ideal. But it is what it is. You know, you got to think the folks campaign this morning, Helena herself, you spend $4 million and you don't win. That's rough, obviously. And her messaging was a little bit disjointed, in my opinion, in the sense that it really was based on negative ads and trying to present herself as the best alternative to Dan McKee. And she did make some compelling arguments about, you know, from being an education mayor, from bringing a business perspective, being a woman, so on and so forth. All these things I think were relevant, and she brought them to the table. And she definitely performed the best in the two television debates, in my opinion, I think in the opinion of many people. But she came up short. She didn't have the coalition that was going to be required to defeat Dan McKee. And how about Nellie Gorbea, Secretary Gorbea, who as recently as July, a Boston Globe poll had her as the front runner in this thing. And just, you know, between campaign cash being low and just the folks McKee back and forth dominating the news cycle over the last several days, she kind of just slipped away, and it just kind of slipped from her. So Nellie Gorbea, who I think a lot of people thought might have been able to be a sleeper candidate last night, and in the midst of the folks McKee back and forth, find a way to build that coalition to be competitive into the final hours, just not able to do it. So at the end of the day, Governor McKee is going to advance. Not a huge shock. You know, it's not as if you know, I think a lot of people didn't take into consideration the fact that Dan McKee wins the races that he enters into, whether you're talking mayor, lieutenant governor, and now in his first primary as a gubernatorial candidate. And he's built that coalition that includes a lot of moderate voters, of course, and some left-leaning people. And he knows how to win in Providence. He knows how to win, obviously, in the Blackstone Valley. Folks did well in South County. Gorbea won Central Falls. But Dan McKee prevails and will advance. And we will certainly be on top of that race, as you would expect here on Bartholomew Town. Over the next several months, we're going to have a debate. At least we're working on it in the gubernatorial race and all the races. And look, how does the McKee campaign pivot at this point? You know, take on Ashley Kalis to try to make the case that she's not only a political outsider and a Rhode Island outsider, but that she's just totally not qualified for an office in terms of a managerial perspective. And she's just not somebody who is representative of the wants and needs of the state. But you think about McKee dodging, whether it's, you know, Tidewater Landing questions, again, the ILO education contract. It just didn't stick with a lot of people. Nonetheless, plenty of people voted for Helena Foulkes. Plenty of people voted for Nellie Gorbea. And again, hardly a mandate and not even close to a mandate for Governor McKee, but you don't need that. You know, the number was always going to be somewhere around 35%. And he came just shy of that in terms of what he received in this primary. And he's got to be feeling pretty good about that. You have to think that they feel like their operation was successful. Of course it was successful. He won. But just in terms of in the closing days, there was a lot of internal nervousness and stress in Camp McKee that Foulkes was going to close the gap and was going to pull this off. Looking at some of the other races last night, Sabina Matos, dominant in her Democratic primary for lieutenant governor, skipping our debate on WPRO in Bartholomew Town, skipping the Channel 10 debate, didn't matter. Her backing of, if you will, Dr. Alexander Scott, the former health director who just the day before had endorsed Helena Bonanno Foulkes, that didn't matter to voters. You know, does it speak to Deborah Giro or Cynthia Mendes in terms of their candidacy? Maybe a little bit. But I think that Matos is somebody who comes from she's a very, very strong politician, very strong political figure, deeply underestimated by a lot of people. And in spite of the fact that there was some predictions that Ruggiero was going to be able to build a coalition, that even if she wasn't able to win in Providence, that the rest of her statewide votes might make a challenge on Matos, it just didn't come to fruition. So big night for Sabina. How about the treasurer's race? James Diosa, the former Central Falls mayor, very, very strong performance, defeating Stephen Pryor, the former Commerce Secretary. And look, that's another one of those, that when, in my opinion, there are a lot of different circles in Rhode Island politics that are relevant, that are players. One of them is the Gina Raimondo Alumni Network. That's where Stephen Pryor comes from. Another one is the Northern Rhode Island Mayoral Peer Group. That's where Diosa comes from. And both in the governor and treasurer race, that Northern Rhode Island Mayoral Peer Group is who dominated. And the Raimondo Alumni Network on a statewide basis, just not able to find the votes, just not able to get it done. So Diosa advances. He'll have a matchup that will be intriguing against James Lathrop, the Republican. You guys may remember, you may have heard Lathrop on the podcast earlier this year. And his lack of experience on a statewide basis is something that is going to dog him a bit, although he's making adjustments. I mean, even in terms of the signage that he's putting up and his messaging. Look, Lathrop's trying to position himself as, he said, he had a Democratic heart and a Republican brain. He's going to try to play the classic New England Republican, fiscally conservative, socially liberal, and experienced in terms of fiscal management, and try to use that against James Diosa. So that's going to be intriguing to watch. In the congressional race, Seth Magaziner, dominant, over 50%. David Siegel, 16% in second place. No one had a shot in this race from Jump Street. Sarah Morgenthau, Joy Fox, Omar Ba, even Spencer Dickinson. No one had a shot in this race. This was Magaziner's race. He had the resources. He had the experience. Didn't matter if he didn't live in the district at the time he announced. Didn't matter that he wanted to run for governor and he pivoted to Congress. Didn't matter that, any of the barbs that were thrown against him in terms of being a trust fund kid and all this, that, and the other. Did not make a difference. Seth Magaziner, dominant in that congressional race. And you know what? And to his credit, he was stable. He was strong throughout. He never really slipped. He never dipped. There was never any kind of incident or brouhaha, or there was nothing that jumped out that made people question his integrity on a fundamental basis or anything like that. And that's why he is the victor there. A couple of interesting General Assembly races that we were following closely last night. Enrique Sanchez defeats Representative Anastasia Williams. Rep. Williams, who has nearly, exactly 30 years in office, will not be there in January. As Enrique Sanchez, backed by the Democratic Socialists of America, able to defeat Rep. Williams with a very strong ground game, door knocking, making a compelling case that Rep. Williams, the Planned Parenthood endorsed, I guess you would say entrenched Democrat, was no longer fit to serve as the representative in that district. And Enrique Sanchez will be a freshman representative come this January. Sam Bell crushed David Salvatore. Not a huge surprise there. Bell very much so liked in his district, Senate 5. Salvatore, the former city council person, trying to weave the thread of being liberal enough to represent that district accurately, but more conservative than Bell, and perhaps trying to argue that he'd be more pragmatic as a leader. Got crushed. Jen Rourke, able to win over Michael Carrero. Rourke, of course, was the person who was punched by John Lugo, her then Republican potential opponent, back at that Roe v. Wade rally. Remember that video that I shot? She was able to beat Michael Carrero, the firefighter in Warwick, who has been, dealing with some personal issues that rose to at least in terms of within Warwick politics relevance, that I think was a turnoff to a lot of people. And look, Rourke benefiting from Michael McCaffrey not seeking re-election and making her own case. She'll now have a general election matchup that'll be a bit challenging. But by and large, and I guess we should mention this as well, actually. Dominic Ruggiero, dominant in his race against both Lenny Seo and Stephen Taco, the Senate president, advancing likely to retain his Senate presidency after, being a bit challenged, having to spend some money. Seo, who came close in 2020 when the district looked different in terms of the map, in terms of the demographics. Seo slipping this time, and far less of an impressive performance. Tierra Mack won. Joe Almeida, I felt like that was never really a serious race, nor do I feel that her race in the general election will be very serious. Mack is, in spite of the, those who will attack her for being immature or whatever, she's popular in her district. And that is what matters at the end of the day, right? The national, you can have Tucker Carlson, whoever bash you. If you're popular in your district, that's what matters. So that's that there. But I want to talk about the progressives in the state as a whole. Let's be honest about it. Yesterday was a terrible, terrible performance by the Rhode Island Political Cooperative. It was awful. Now, the co-op model, theoretically, you can make an argument that it essentially plays the role. It's not a political party, of course. But you can make the argument that it can serve in some ways as a third party. But it doesn't function that way. The branding, it doesn't jump out as if to say, hey, we are an alternative operation, the way that maybe you could make an argument that the Libertarian Party of Rhode Island is, or something like that. They match up inside the Democratic primary and try to take on entrenched mainstream, quote-unquote mainstream Democrats in primaries that are very, very difficult. But more so than anything, I wonder if the model itself was spread too thin. The whole, we're going to have a whole new government. We're going to have, 50 new people in the General Assembly. It seems to me, just looking on the outside, that, I don't know that the resources were there to run 50 or whatever it is, competitive races inside in General Assembly races. I'm not convinced that the nuance is there in terms of from one district to the next, one region of the state to the next. Matt Brown had a terrible performance in the governor's race. Cynthia Mendes did much, much better in the lieutenant governor's race, still not competitive. And other than a handful of people, Jen Rourke comes to mind. Other than a handful of candidates, not a good performance at all. And that model, you just have to wonder if it's time to rethink quickly, because there was some success in 2020, right? There was a different appetite. You're coming out of the Trump era. You're coming out of the social justice movement of 2020 post-George Floyd. You're coming out of the origins of the pandemic. But there is an appetite for progressive policies and progressive voices on a statewide basis. But the way it's framed is so critical. I don't know if it's that you form a new party. That's an uphill battle in and of itself, obviously. So when you challenge within the Democratic primaries, the nuance of one candidate to the next, it set itself up for way too easy an opportunity for attack ads. Hey, the opposition literally printed essentially the same exact messaging to attack any candidate who had a real shot of victory in a Democratic primary matchup that was backed or a member of the political cooperative. Hey, this candidate, they're going to, they want to defund the police. They're not about crime. They're associated with a democratic socialist. They're going to be, their policies are cuckoo. That was the messaging. And that broad stroke was effective because the umbrella of the cooperative didn't have the nuance on a district by district, race by race basis that I think it was required, nor the resources. So progressives have got to lick their wounds, figure out what went wrong specifically on a district by district basis. And hey, there's some big wins potentially to come still. It's not a complete strikeout. But I saw a graphic last night. I don't have it in front of me now. But it showed, just a complete blowout for the progressives in this state. Those members of the co-op on a race-by-race basis. And Matt Brown, again, we're gonna have a whole new government model. It's anything but that. Progressives need to regroup. They need to rethink how they're operating. Enjoy the victories that you have. Enjoy the seats you've retained. Cooperative alumni like Tiara Mack, successful. Brianna Henrys. But the losses are going to be stinging. Calkin lost. They lost Mende's seat. And it's just going to be an uphill battle going into 2024. And what needs to be a complete reimagining of what a Rhode Island progressive is and how do you build a coalition. You need a coalition to win. You cannot be in an echo chamber courting voters who are explicitly aligned with the type of messaging that the co-op pushed. It has to be broader. That's hard to hear. The alternative is true revolution. And I don't know how many people have access to warplanes or anything like that. That's the alternative. Everything else is for the coffee shop. It's for hanging out and sitting outside and having chats and the whole thing, which is great. Ideas are powerful. What is it? The pen is mightier than the sword, no doubt. And I am not calling for any kind of physical revolution. All I'm saying is that you want to have a revolution. There's two ways to do it. One is through a military intervention, which I don't think anybody in this state expects to happen. Let's get real. Let's be honest about it. That's how else are you going to do it? The only other way is through a nuanced approach that starting in going into 2024, one candidate at a time, one matchup at a time. That's how you're going to do it. That's how this progressive revolution is going to happen, if it's going to happen. You can work together, and you should work together with people who have a like mind. But this model did not work. It needs to be either dismantled or completely reconfigured. It was a valiant effort. A lot of really, really amazing people are involved in this project. And they got to regroup. Straight up. Providence Mayor Gonzalo Cuervo came on strong, rose to a level of being absolutely competitive. Nearville LaFortune never went away. Got the backing of the teachers union, very relevant in conversation, but it was Brett Smiley's race. And Smiley able to, through a coalition of voters that included some progressives, East Side, and as Dan McGowan described, old Buddy Cianci voters. and making the argument that it was time for a more practical, pragmatic approach to governance. That's how it was done. Cuervo, somebody who is, who I think would have been a great mayor, just not able to get that coalition, even though he had found votes that were maybe outside of where he had his strongest base of support. Not able to pull it off. Brett Smiley will be the next mayor of Providence. And you know what? For Smiley, let's see how open he is to bringing in voices that are divergent, maybe from his reputation at this point in time as being the quote-unquote more conservative candidate. Because as we were talking about on the radio last night, Smiley back in 2014 was the progressive candidate. He really hasn't shifted in his positions. It's that the party has shifted. People's wants have shifted to the left. And going back to the progressive scenario, that's what's frustrating. People want a lot of the things that the progressive movement has to offer. It just needs to be packaged in a way that they can digest. It just needs to be presented in a way that Joe and Mary Public at the dining room table, when they're figuring out on Monday night to go in, who should we vote for? Who have paid 0.0 attention to politics on a local level since the last time they voted in 2020. How do you win them over? What's that brand look like? What's that message look like? How nuanced can it be? That's the revolution that needs to happen if you're from the progressive field. So now we look towards November. We look towards Election Day, the general election season. Soon the weather will be getting more crisp. It'll be getting darker earlier. And it will be time for the next go-round. Magazine or Fung, very, very competitive. Impossible to say how that one's going to go at this point. Could go either way. McKee-Kalis, McKee has the strong upper hand. Anything's possible in that race. We'll be here covering it for you all throughout the next several months. And if you have any thoughts on this, bill@ripodcast.com. You can email me anytime. We'll have a lot of analysis. We'll have a lot of interviews. We'll have debates. We'll have coverage from the field. It's all heading your way here on Rhode Island's podcast of record, Bartholomew Town. Everybody have a great day. The last thing I want to say is if you worked on a campaign, winner, non-winner, take today, take the next couple of days to congratulate yourself, get some rest, hydrate. By entering into the arena, you have an enormous amount of courage. You have an enormous amount of guts that most people don't have. You are willing to make a sacrifice that most people aren't willing to make, and you deserve all the credit in the world. And for those of you who didn't win, and those of you who were backing a candidate, volunteering for a candidate, working for a candidate, dreaming for a candidate that didn't win, regroup, repackage, and get ready for 2024. It's going to come fast. It feels like it was just a couple of months ago that we were in the 2020 election. It's going to come fast. A year from now, it's going to be time to up. We're going to start talking about the presidential election in less than a year from now. You get much more of a turnout in a presidential election year. How do you get those new voters into your camp? That's the message that you need to be thinking about. But in the meantime, enjoy the rest of the summer, and be proud of the fact that you participated in this process at any level. Because as frustrating as it can be, it's a beautiful thing. And there's a lot more ahead for all of us here in Rhode Island as we start to move towards what I think will be a very, very critical decade and a very, very critical period in our country, in our world. And Rhode Island has a lot to offer to that conversation. All right, everybody. Have a great day, and we'll talk soon.
At HealthSource RI for Employers, we provide access to health insurance to more than 1,100 local businesses and nonprofits, and 96% of them renew through us every year. Maybe it's our choice of 19 different health plans, our 10 years of customizing solutions, or our one local team of dedicated experts helping employers find quality health insurance. See how our numbers stack up for you. Learn more at healthsourceri.com/employers.